What if the people around you have the power to shape your feelings without you ever realizing it? The silent web of guilt is more than discomfort. It's a skillfully woven tool of manipulation, tearing at the core of your confidence. This is not a friendly manual on better communication. It is an unflinching journey into the dark underbelly of psychological guilt, exposing secrets that others would rather keep hidden. Unraveling these tactics is not just about feeling better. It's about reclaiming your mind, your dignity, and your autonomy. Are you ready to see through the invisible chains that hold you back? Freedom from Guilt, Breaking the Cycle of Guilt Trips, written and published by Stealth Psychology. Chapter 1, Understanding the Guilt Pattern. It is late in the evening when Emily, tired from a demanding day, receives a message from her friend. The text is carefully worded. "I just thought you cared, but maybe I was wrong." The sharp pang that hits Emily's chest is immediate, a familiar wave of shame and responsibility. She wonders if she has truly failed as a friend, despite knowing she simply needed to rest that evening. What Emily does not realize is that she has just stepped into a subtle but powerful script, written not by chance but by design. The manipulator's true goal is rarely about friendship or affection. It is about control. Whether it is emotional leverage in personal relationships, a quest to make someone feel perpetually indebted, or even sowing the seeds of social isolation so one remains tied only to the manipulator, these patterns emerge skillfully, playing upon our fear of rejection, our innate drive for approval, and our capacity for guilt. Guilt is a universal emotion, one that everyone has felt from childhood to adulthood. Yet when guilt is instrumentalized with precision, transformed from a natural reaction into a mechanism of power, it goes unnoticed by its victims. Most people never suspect a pattern until their confidence erodes bit by bit, until making choices freely begins to feel dangerous instead of liberating. The manipulator thrives on ambiguity, blurring the boundaries between healthy accountability and toxic responsibility. Victims are coaxed into carrying burdens not truly their own, reevaluating their intentions and actions through a distorted lens, convinced that their boundaries are flaws to be erased. With every interaction covertly steeped in emotional demand, the manipulator edges closer to their purpose, be it demanding compliance with decisions, pressuring for financial favors, or slowly pushing friends and loved ones into modest but ever-deepening social isolation. The grip of this pattern is tightest when it is invisible. For those ensnared, guilt ceases to be a fleeting feeling and becomes a guiding principle, one that robs them of joy in their achievements and causes second-guessing of the simplest decisions. Each apology required, each concession made, feels like the right thing to do, even as a deeper anxiety whispers that something is wrong. Often, the true extent of the trap is only glimpsed in hindsight, when freedoms have narrowed, relationships feel draining and transactional, and the world no longer seems safe for authentic self-expression. The fundamental drive of the manipulator is not connection, but the creation of dependency and self-doubt. Understanding this guilt pattern is the first step in unraveling the web. Recognizing how emotional triggers are exploited and how cycles of blame are subtly introduced draws back the curtain on a psychological game few consciously acknowledge. This is the hidden truth. You are not merely reacting to your own conscience, but to a plan set in motion by someone determined to bend your will. Before real independence can be reclaimed, the darkness must be illuminated. Only then can the unwinding begin. The influence of guilt as a weapon stretches into the smallest crevices of emotional life. Victims often describe a tangled confusion, where simple decisions like declining an invitation, asking for help, or prioritizing personal needs become anxiety-ridden calculations. This emotional manipulation can lead to overwhelming feelings of shame and persistent self-doubt, steadily chipping away at one's sense of self-worth. The inner voice, once a guide, is hijacked, replaced by an almost constant suspicion that every action or word might hurt someone else, or worse, render one unworthy of affection and community. This relentless self-scrutiny paints daily life in tones of anxiety, and in time, the original self fades into the background, replaced by a hyper-alert version, desperate not to offend or disappoint. Consider the story of Mark, a professional in his 30s whose career was thriving until a colleague began routinely suggesting in small ways that his success came at the expense of others in the team. Each comment seemed subtle, sometimes cloaked as a joke, other times as friendly advice. It's great how well you do, but some people feel left behind. Over weeks, Mark began to second-guess his work, volunteering for less visible projects, sharing credit unnecessarily, and apologizing for achievements. His enthusiasm dimmed, and he withdrew at work, nurturing a new belief: to avoid guilt, he could no longer allow himself to shine. In this space, workplace manipulation flourished, damaging not only one person's confidence, but also the integrity of teamwork at large. Relationships, especially those in families and romantic partnerships, are particularly susceptible to the guilt pattern. A reported case in the Journal of Social and Personal Relationships details Sarah, who after each disagreement with her partner, found herself apologizing, even when she knew she had done nothing wrong. Her partner's skillful reminders of past mistakes, or remarks about how her words hurt him deeply, left Sarah engulfed by remorse. Psychological research underscores that such tactics, termed guilt induction, are alarmingly common in emotionally manipulative dynamics, and according to published studies, the recipients of such manipulation often develop lower self-esteem, struggle to assert themselves, and live in constant emotional unrest. Why do intelligent, capable people fall for the guilt pattern? Part of this answer lies in human evolution. Guilt, as documented by evolutionary psychologists, is an emotion tied to social cooperation. It historically kept our ancestors from breaking important social bonds, encouraging amends and promoting trust. When distorted, however, it latches on to those most invested in empathy and community, precisely the people most likely to want to make it right. Manipulators are attuned to this vulnerability, reshaping natural empathy into a tool for domination. Over time, the victim is kept in a perpetual state of penance, always justifying existence and suppressing real desires. The psychological scars left behind are rarely visible, but devastating in depth. Interpersonal closeness is replaced by silent, guarded performances. Even after the manipulator is gone, echoes of guilt shape future relationships and limit personal freedom. As research shows, wounds created by persistent guilt trips are resistant to healing, precisely because the victim questions the legitimacy of their own experience, trapped in an endless apology. As this shadow spreads, it becomes clear why learning to spot these tactics is no mere luxury, it is essential. In the next part, we will begin to uncover the overlooked warning signs that reveal when guilt is no longer just an emotion, but a calculated method of control. Manipulators do not operate randomly. They are astute observers, carefully seeking out those who are more susceptible to guilt-based control. The process of identifying targets often begins with small tests, harmless-seeming requests or gentle prods designed to gauge someone's boundaries and willingness to take responsibility for others' emotions. Individuals who respond with immediate concern, empathy, or self-questioning signal themselves as promising candidates. People-pleasers, those with strong inclinations toward kindness, and individuals unsure of their worth are particularly attractive to those skilled in exploiting guilt. Manipulators hone in on qualities like reliability, a tendency to avoid conflict, and the eagerness to maintain harmony at any cost. Consider the case of Nora, a young professional newly hired at a bustling office. Within weeks, her manager noticed Nora's habit of apologizing for things beyond her control and her readiness to volunteer for additional, often thankless. Sensing opportunity, the manager began subtly linking team setbacks to Nora's actions, phrasing it as, "If only we'd caught this earlier, Nora, maybe things wouldn't have been so stressful for everyone." The effect was cumulative. Over time, Nora came to anticipate blame before mistakes were even made, and readily took on more than her fair share, believing it was up to her to hold the workplace together. The manipulator's careful focus on her sense of duty set the stage for a deepening entanglement where personal boundaries dissolved and anxiety flourished. In another scenario, a family member targeting a sibling with a sensitive conscience uses the language of tradition and expectation. "You know how much your presence means to your mother. She's been feeling so alone since you moved out." This comment plays on the sibling's identity as a caring child and reliable family supporter, planting a seed of guilt for their independent choices. The manipulation is so subtle that instead of questioning the fairness of the demand, the sibling experiences a creeping sense of shame intersecting with obligation. Over time, the manipulated individual internalizes these messages as part of their self-concept, making it nearly impossible to see where healthy responsibility ends and manipulation begins. Critical to the manipulator's success is the gradual psychological shift within the victim. At first, boundaries may seem slightly negotiable, perhaps altered for the sake of peace. But as the cycle continues, a once strong sense of self becomes clouded by doubt. The victim begins to second-guess their motives, double-check every word or omission, and eventually see themselves not as autonomous actors, but as perpetual failures in the eyes of those they care about. Manipulation becomes harder to identify because it arrives cloaked in concern, love, tradition, or duty. Each word carefully chosen to nudge the target toward relinquishing control. Understanding how manipulators identify and condition their targets is not merely an interesting revelation. It is a vital weapon for self-defense and recovery. Without this knowledge, one remains vulnerable to invisible assaults on autonomy and sanity. But with this awareness, resistance is possible, and self-loyalty can begin to return. Recognizing these early tactics means breaking the silence that traps so many in unhealthy cycles. Prepare to journey deeper. In the next section, we will delve into how these manipulations escalate, drawing victims into relentless cycles of control and learned helplessness. Chapter 2: The Hidden Manipulation Game. On a quiet afternoon, Michael finds himself sitting across from his partner at the dining table, tension simmering beneath the surface. The discussion begins as a simple conversation about shared finances, a topic that should be straightforward for any couple. Yet with subtle precision, his partner steers the talk away from numbers and towards neglect, disappointment, and guilt. She reminds him of past promises and missed opportunities, emphasizing the sacrifices she claims to have made for their future together. Her words are measured, evoking uncertainty in Michael and painting a picture where he is perpetually in debt, not just emotionally, but financially as well. Michael struggles to defend his actions, but every attempt is gently deflected. By the end of the evening, he feels both responsible for their financial issues and indebted for her supposed patience and understanding. He is unaware that what transpired was not just an argument. It was a finely executed manipulation. This is the heart of the hidden manipulation game. It works quietly, drawing the unsuspecting deeper into a web where simple concerns are spun into complex emotional traps. The manipulator's strategy is not born out of miscommunication or accidental missteps, but a clear intent to control outcomes or push specific agendas. Whether the end goal is to extract money, maintain emotional dominance, or foster isolation and dependency, the methods are designed to be as undetectable as possible while yielding maximum return for the manipulator. Most victims, like Michael, recognize signs of discord or discomfort, but fail to realize that their emotional responses have been orchestrated. The control is engineered beneath layers of guilt, concern, and obligation, hiding the manipulator's true motives until escape feels insurmountable. The subtlety lies in how everyday interactions are transformed. Rather than open demands or threats, manipulators turn to nuanced remarks, questions about loyalty, reminders of past kindness, or stories highlighting your shortcomings in contrast to their steadfastness. Each exchange carries a message. You are responsible for their happiness. You owe them for your failings. And if the relationship falters, the blame is yours alone. Over time, these tactics alter the victim's sense of self and boundaries at such a slow, creeping pace that the loss of autonomy is rarely noticed until it has already become the norm. This is the psychological game in its purest form. Victims consent to their own imprisonment, mistakenly believing it is for the greater good or simply the best they can hope for. Many never see this for what it is, a premeditated manipulation that exploits the natural desire for harmony, love, or security. Instead, they internalize fault, apologizing for imagined missteps and sacrificing more of themselves to mollify the manipulator. The reality only starts to reveal itself when exhaustion, resentment, or a whispered sense of injustice becomes impossible to ignore. At this point, the true challenge emerges, recognizing the doors that were quietly shut and finding the strength to open them once again. In the hidden game of manipulation, knowledge remains the most powerful counter-move, a truth many realize only after the game has already cost them far too much. The hidden manipulation game wreaks havoc within the landscape of emotions, often distorting feelings into weapons against their owners. At its most insidious, this psychological game creates overwhelming confusion, sadness laced with guilt, love so tightly bound to anxiety that relief only comes through compliance or self-sacrifice. This emotional volatility means that each choice, no matter how small, becomes potentially fraught with repercussions. Victims quickly learn to anticipate disappointment or anger, not only in the manipulator but in themselves, heightening their tendency to seek safety through appeasement. Gradually, this takes a toll on clear thinking and authentic decision-making. The mind, previously guided by personal values and rational assessment, is hijacked, becoming increasingly preoccupied with how to avoid blame. Ordinary choices, such as choosing between two job offers or making plans with friends, feel riddled with questions about what the manipulator wants and how their own desires will trigger emotional fallout. Relationships begin to buckle under this pressure. One study published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence found that victims of emotional guilt tactics frequently withdraw from friends or family, believing themselves to be the source of conflict or misunderstanding. In these cases, the manipulator's ultimate goal of social isolation becomes reality, as the victim complies, often without needing to be asked. The more isolated the individual, the greater the manipulator's influence, creating an environment in which self-doubt festers unchecked by outside voices. Close partnerships suffer as trust erodes. Intimacy loses ground to suspicion, obligation, and exhaustion. The person who was once vibrant and connected retreats, managing each conversation as if it might set off a silent alarm. To understand why people become entwined in this manipulation game, we need only look at our natural wiring. According to research in evolutionary psychology, guilt and empathy evolved as social glues, fostering cooperation and repair in communities. For people with high empathy, the weight of guilt feels unbearable. They are compelled to set things right, even at great cost to themselves. Manipulators sense this, deliberately playing on tendencies that make someone a generous friend, offspring, or partner. Psychological studies of abusive relationships frequently note that those most at risk are the ones who prize loyalty, responsibility, and consensus above all. Manipulators turn these strengths into leverage, reframing virtue as a burden and securing acquiescence without ever raising their voice. Self-esteem collapses in these conditions. Victims, once self-assured, report feeling consistently inadequate. Each episode of manipulation plants toxic seeds. If you value yourself, you are told, you risk causing pain. If you resist, you prove yourself selfish or cold. Over time, this guidance becomes internalized, a phantom presence in the mind that continues operating even in the absence of the manipulator. The damage lingers, reframing every new relationship through suspicion and guilt, leaving lasting uncertainty about where genuine concern ends and coercion begins. The urgency of recognizing these tactics cannot be overstated, as by the time a person grasps the scope of what has happened, the psychological game may have already redefined their identity and worldview. Even the most resilient individuals can find themselves lost in this carefully constructed maze, vulnerable to repetition. For many, the only hope of escape lies in becoming fluent in the subtle cues that signal manipulation, shadows visible only to those who have learned to see in the dark. The next section will reveal these hidden warning signs, inviting awareness that can turn victims into survivors and reclaim the inner ground lost in this invisible game. Manipulators are not impulsive in their selection of targets. Rather, they are methodical in identifying those most susceptible to guilt-based psychological tactics. It often begins with observation, a keen assessment of who in a group instinctively tries to keep the peace, or who volunteers for unglamorous tasks no one else wants to claim. Those who apologize frequently, or are the first to mediate after group discord, become particularly attractive, as these habits signal a desire to resolve conflict and avoid negative emotions at almost any cost. Such traits are inadvertently advertised through small gestures, words swallowed during disagreement, burdens assumed silently, or tense smiles concealing discomfort during tension, all giving manipulators the roadmap they need. In one workplace scenario, a supervisor noticed that David, a new hire, was always first to step in when tensions rose. David's pattern of smoothing over disputes and offering to cover others' responsibilities signaled a malleable sense of personal boundaries. The supervisor subtly assigned David more tasks than his peers and couched every critique in disappointment about the team's morale rather than objective feedback. Over time, David stopped seeing his role as a professional collaboration and began viewing his work as a lifelong apology he could never quite complete. Here, the subtle tactic, playing on responsibility, evolved into a quiet pattern of chronic overwork and eroded confidence, while overt blame was rarely expressed directly. Family dynamics often provide an even starker laboratory for manipulation. Ella, the eldest daughter in a tight-knit but demanding family, felt constant pressure to model goodness and remain available for every celebration and crisis. Her younger siblings, sensing her reluctance to ever say no, began blaming her absence for their own disappointments or chastising her for any hint of complaint. The real shift, though, occurred internally. Ella questioned her individuality, battling guilt for her own ambitions and shrinking her world to fit what she imagined would please others. Step by step, the manipulative dynamic recast her sense of identity. Her worth became entangled with her usefulness, so that setting boundaries felt synonymous with betrayal. Psychological shifts unfold gradually and insidiously. The first change is often internal discomfort, an uneasy sense that choices seem harder or never quite enough. As manipulative tactics accumulate, confusion emerges about basic wants and needs. Compliance feels mandatory, though nothing explicit has been demanded. Eventually, the manipulated individual internalizes the guilt script, taking on self-blame for circumstances engineered by someone else. Familiar patterns of self-justification become ingrained, explaining away the manipulator's behavior or rehearsing apologies for future imaginary offenses. Quietly, autonomy slips away as the compulsion to keep the peace overwhelms the dream of fairness or joy. This detailed pattern recognition is not over-analysis, it is a vital defense. Understanding the specific combinations of people-pleasing, conflict aversion, and grooming by manipulators is the crucial first line of resistance. Without this self-awareness, anyone, even those with strong intellects and self-respect, can find themselves caught in a net they never saw forming. Awareness does not just prevent manipulation, it is the beginning of reclaiming personal power. In the coming section, we will unravel how the manipulation game deepens, intensifying control and trapping victims in recurring cycles from which it can seem impossible to break free. Chapter 3: Breaking Emotional Control Loops. Imagine a quiet Sunday afternoon in a small family kitchen. Anna stands at the counter, her mother seated across from her, both mugs of tea untouched and cooling. Anna's mother sighs, gazing meaningfully at the clock and mentioning in a low voice how lonely the house is without Anna's visits. There's no direct accusation, only the gentle reminder of how much Anna owes her childhood happiness to her mother's sacrifices. Anna's plans to meet friends slip away as guilt coaxes her into staying, afraid she'll cause pain or appear ungrateful. By the time Anna leaves hours later, she is heavy with shame and confusion, trapped in a cycle where her mother's emotional well-being is placed subtly and relentlessly at her feet. In this web, any attempt Anna makes to assert her independence is recast as an act of selfishness, and breaking the cycle seems impossible. This is the heart of the emotional control loop. Unlike blatant manipulation, which might spark confrontation or resistance, the control loop operates quietly, camouflaged as love, duty, or sacrifice. The manipulator's ultimate goal could be anything from the need to feel indispensable to financial security, or simply the desire for perpetual compliance within the relationship. Through carefully crafted emotional appeals, subtle guilt trips, and recurring reminders of past debts, real or imagined, victims begin to lose clarity about their own intentions. What begins as a desire to do the right thing slowly morphs into a reflex, saying yes to preserve another's mood, offering money to avoid confrontation, forfeiting personal plans to prevent someone else's discomfort. Each reaction reinforces the manipulator's hold, tightening the loop with each cycle. Many victims fail to recognize how deep their entanglement runs until escape feels unthinkable. In Anna's case, years of deference to her mother's emotional tides means that her self-worth and peace become measured by someone else's satisfaction. She is taught to subordinate her feelings. Any frustration, restlessness, or desire for time apart is dressed up as evidence of her deficiency or lack of gratitude. This emotional tailoring is never aggressive enough to alert outsiders, but it depletes the victim's confidence, gradually rewiring the mind to believe that true goodness exists only in consistent sacrifice. Anna, like so many in emotionally manipulative relationships, internalizes responsibility for moods and crises she did not create, constructing her own invisible prison with each well-intentioned compromise. The truth that often goes unrecognized is that every emotional control loop, regardless of context or specific demands, is ultimately designed to benefit the manipulator. Their comfort comes at the expense of their target's autonomy. Their sense of order is propped up by another's willingness to surrender dreams, plans, and even values. Too often, victims remain locked in these patterns, reassuring themselves that sacrifice is love or that it's simply the way things are. Only when exhaustion sets in, or when a fleeting moment of rebellion briefly surfaces, does the magnitude of the manipulation shimmer into focus. It is at this exact juncture that awareness can take root, a critical awakening required to even contemplate the risk of breaking the cycle. As we venture deeper, it becomes clear that seeing the pattern is just one step. Tearing free from its grip requires understanding the emotional machinery that keeps it spinning. When someone is drawn into an emotional control loop, the first casualty is often their ability to trust their own emotions. Conflicting feelings spiral beneath the surface: concern for the manipulator's needs, a dread of confrontation, fear of rejection, and a gnawing sense of inadequacy. The victim finds themselves on a relentless emotional seesaw, oscillating between short-lived relief from compliance and a persistent background anxiety. Small acts of resistance, such as declining an invitation or expressing mild dissatisfaction, are swiftly followed by emotional retaliation: a sigh, silence, a suggestion of disappointment, or a story about the manipulator's own sacrifices. Gradually, emotional independence erodes as guilt overtakes every moment of joy or self-prioritization. Rather than forming boundaries, decisions become desperate bids to avoid shame and maintain peace, no matter the personal cost. These psychological games do not unfold in a vacuum. In one case described by a therapist specializing in family dynamics, a patient named Sam recounted how any assertion of his individuality was met by his father's carefully crafted story of hardship or parental devotion. Over time, Sam stopped suggesting activities, declined social invitations, and retreated into passivity. Any assertion was viewed as betrayal, and so he began suppressing his desires almost reflexively. The effects within relationships are often devastating. Spontaneous happiness fades, replaced with caution and calculation. Partners report feeling perpetually watched, as if every emotion or need must be filtered through the manipulator's potential response. Friends and family eventually find their loved one distant, distracted, and anxious. Psychological research on emotional manipulation confirms the insidious nature of these loops. In a study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, researchers found that chronic exposure to guilt-based control leads not only to diminished self-esteem, but also to impaired cognitive function and social withdrawal. Participants in emotionally manipulative relationships reported significant difficulties in making decisions, stemming less from lack of information and more from an entrenched fear of disappointing or being misunderstood by others. What's even more disturbing is that many of these individuals have a history of generosity and empathy, personal traits the manipulator exploits mercilessly. Their tendency to empathize quickly becomes a liability, transforming selflessness from virtue into vulnerability. People fall into these cycles precisely because they long for harmony and validation, and because manipulative tactics are interlaced with moments of reward. brief instances when their sacrifice is acknowledged or a reprieve from guilt is granted. Neurologically, this intermittent reinforcement creates strong bonds, cementing loyalty through unpredictable, yet craved emotional rewards. Victims begin to believe the loop is normal, sometimes even noble, rationalizing their own diminishing agency as proof of love or maturity. In an act of self-preservation, they may avoid deeper questions out of fear that acknowledging the depth of their entrapment will render escape impossible or shake the only relationships they have left. What most victims do not realize is that these patterns are not intrinsic flaws, but are rooted in external manipulation that takes advantage of their humanity. Distinguishing between healthy obligation and coerced compliance is far from simple, especially when guilt masks itself as familial love, romantic loyalty, or ethical duty. Recognizing that your sense of worthiness or ability to choose is being systematically eroded is frightening, but it is a vital first step. In the next part, we will strip away the disguise, exposing hidden warning signs that often escape notice until freedom seems out of reach. Emotional manipulators rely on a skillful perception of who is most susceptible to their tactics. Their selection of targets is rarely accidental but deliberate, built upon observation and small tests of a person's emotional vulnerabilities. They note who apologizes quickly, who shoulders tasks no one else volunteers for, who hesitates to disagree, and who changes plans at the last minute to accommodate others. Even more telling is how someone responds to subtle disappointment, a sigh, an averted gaze, or an expression of silent suffering. Targets who react with immediate concern or scramble to set things right are ideal. These responses reveal a profound discomfort with guilt and an eagerness to remedy emotional disharmony, a dynamic the manipulator exploits with growing confidence. Take, for example, the experiences of Marcus, a graduate student living with two roommates. Whenever there was a disagreement about shared expenses or cleaning duties, Marcus inevitably felt responsible, even if the evidence directly contradicted it. One roommate in particular regularly offered backhanded compliments or told stories illustrating their own hardships, followed by quietly leaving Marcus to manage household chores alone. At first, Marcus noticed only a vague dissatisfaction within himself, a subtle resentment overshadowed by shame for thinking poorly of his roommate. Eventually, he began volunteering his time and money with growing frequency, unable to identify the precise moment he lost his ability to say no. The initial manipulative tactic, a covert narrative of suffering and disappointment, created a mental environment where Marcus viewed each issue through the lens of his own possible failures. In a different context, consider Julia, whose best friend always seemed to need her the most when Julia had other commitments or was enjoying success. The friend's melancholy remarks about feeling abandoned or the unnoticed sacrifices made for Julia quietly cast shadows over her happiness. Without any explicit demand, Julia found herself canceling personal pursuits and downplaying achievements, imprisoned by the need to safeguard her friend's emotional state. Over time, Julia's internal world shifted. She developed a constant vigilance, scanning every scenario for signs of trouble. She grew nearly incapable of distinguishing her genuine desires from the guilt foisted onto her by repeated and subtle messages. The psychological evolution for victims of emotional control loops is marked by increasing confusion and the slow adoption of belief systems tailored by the manipulator. At first, there may be discomfort or self-doubt, but as the manipulation intensifies, original values and boundaries fade. Conflicted emotions are dismissed in favor of anticipated peace, and the act of self-sacrifice transforms from an occasional gesture into a compulsory, automatic pattern. Victims often justify the manipulator's behavior to themselves, internalizing guilt as an enduring moral imperative. This learned selflessness is not born of altruism, but is instead a carefully engineered reaction intended to keep targets compliant and unaware of their own erosion. Gaining a meticulous understanding of how targets are chosen and conditioned is essential for self-defense. With clear vision, those most vulnerable can uncover their own patterns before they lead to further entrapment. This awareness is not merely theoretical, it is the bedrock of resistance against future cycles of manipulation. As we move forward, the escalating phase of emotional control will be brought into focus, exposing how the mechanisms of domination are solidified in daily life and how victims are further ensnared within the cycle. Chapter 4. Rebuilding Inner Self-Worth. In a hushed living room, the television plays quietly in the background as Rachel sits scrolling through messages on her phone. Her partner, seated next to her, drops repeated hints about how unappreciated they feel, remarking with disappointment on Rachel's decision to spend the evening working instead of attending their friend's dinner together. Casual comments are delivered with an air of melancholy, each loaded with memories of sacrifices supposedly made for Rachel's benefit. As the evening unfolds, the discussion expands from tonight's missed dinner to a subtle chronicle of unreturned favors, until Rachel, feeling as if her entire character is under scrutiny, finally offers an anxious apology. She makes a mental note to put her own needs aside next time, and with that, the cycle repeats. What she does not realize is that at every turn, her partner's dissatisfaction is not rooted in a simple dinner or companionship, but in a calculated campaign to make Rachel question her worth unless she is perpetually available. Her partner's unspoken aim is to establish emotional control, a quiet but persistent demand for self-negation wrapped in the guise of longing and disappointment. This is the often invisible threshold at which the erosion of self-worth begins. The manipulator's strategy, whether conscious or instinctive, is not just to have their needs met, but to remodel the very way Rachel sees herself. Over time, repeated emotional pressure leads her to tie her value to her ability to meet unrealistic and ever-shifting expectations. In the arms of such manipulation, the concept of self-worth is stealthily redefined. Worth is no longer centered on innate qualities, resilience, or achievements, but reduced instead to a tally of sacrifices made and disappointments prevented. It becomes harder and harder for Rachel to remember who she truly is without the weight of another's approval. Each time she surrenders her priorities, however small, they chip away at the scaffolding of her internal self, leaving her believing she is only as good as her last act of compliance. Perhaps most harrowing is how seamless and ordinary these patterns can become. No raised voices, no direct accusations, just a steady current of subtle reminders that one's individuality is a flaw or a threat. Long-term exposure to such tactics can leave profound scars, fostering self-doubt and anxiety, which in turn breed further compliance. By the time Rachel ponders her growing exhaustion or wonders if her dreams and goals still truly belong to her, her identity has already been partially rewritten by the guilt-driven narrative. The manipulator's ultimate triumph is the achievement of control that is so deeply embedded, the victim polices their own behavior out of habit rather than fear of confrontation. Few recognize that this gradual unmaking of self-worth is itself a central objective of emotional or psychological manipulation. For those ensnared in these dynamics, the idea of simply asserting boundaries or rediscovering their own perspectives often comes wrapped in shame or uncertainty. By the time the patterns turn evident enough to be questioned, much of one's confidence has already been worn away. Realizing that your belief in your own value has been compromised is more than unsettling. It's a wake-up call that whispers of the hidden forces at work behind your daily choices. As we peel back the layers of this manipulation, the power in reclaiming self-worth will emerge not just as an act of defiance, but as the very foundation of freedom and personal growth. Repeated exposure to manipulation and chronic guilt erodes inner self-worth with a precision that is both silent and devastating. When one's value becomes tethered to the emotional weather of another person, the very definition of self becomes distorted. Emotions, rather than serving as natural signals about the world or relationships, morph into tools of self-monitoring and policing. Victims of this dynamic experience persistent anxiety, hyper-vigilant about each word and action, and perpetually afraid of triggering disappointment or criticism. Any fleeting moment of contentment or pride is quickly interrupted by the lurking fear that a mistake or omission will undo all sense of belonging or acceptance. When decisions are made, they are filtered through a lens of anticipated judgment. Is it good enough, selfless enough, safe enough to prevent another emotional disturbance? This corrosive process is exemplified in the case of Lorraine, a talented designer who once took pride in her independent thinking and creativity. In the early years of her romantic relationship, her partner showered her with support, but gradually began requesting more of Lorraine's time and attention. Every instance where Lorraine worked late, pursued new projects, or treated herself to moments of solitude was followed by her partner's quiet withdrawal of affection. Subtle remarks suggested Lorraine had lost interest or was growing selfish, and before she realized what was happening, Lorraine began avoiding things she loved, retracting herself to avoid any sense of failing as a partner. Over months and years, Lorraine's confidence receded. Her choices were made in service to her partner's peace, and even her career decisions became acts of compensation rather than ambition. Her sense of self, once robust and singular, atrophied under the pressure to prove worthiness by constant sacrifice. Social psychologists studying attachment and guilt-based manipulation warn that such patterns are rarely conscious in victims. The drive behind compliance is seldom naivete or weakness. It is an instinctive desire for connection, a need to matter, and a hope that love or approval can be secured if only one tries hard enough. In environments where guilt is weaponized, these natural drives become dangerous, turned against the very people who feel them most deeply. Research published by the American Psychological Association reveals that chronic self-sacrifice for approval correlates with lowered self-esteem, decreased resilience to stress, and a heightened risk for emotional burnout and depressive symptoms. The distorted internal monologue that forms, "I am failing unless I am giving," becomes a permanent echo, reinforcing a cycle that feels both inescapable and invisible. Those affected by the erosion of self-worth often say they lost the ability to tell where their true personality ends and the manipulator's influence begins. Relationships, instead of being sites of mutual growth and affirmation, become battlegrounds for validation where one's individuality vanishes beneath a smothering pressure to always make it right. Eventually, self-criticism replaces self-appreciation. What is perhaps most tragic is that, by the time this pattern is recognized, its roots are deeply intertwined with the person's entire sense of identity and ability to imagine another way of living. Unraveling these threads is possible, but only with clear insight. In the section that follows, sharp attention will be given to the subtle warning signs that distinguish natural relational give and take from a loss of self through manipulation and guilt. Manipulators who seek to erode self-worth rarely act without intention. Their first move is often the calculated act of identifying individuals whose emotional makeup makes them susceptible to guilt and pressure. These manipulators notice the signs of an accommodating nature with deliberate care. People who show eagerness to please, apologize even when not at fault, and readily assume responsibility for disharmony or disappointment are quietly flagged as reliable targets. This is not always due to evident weakness. Often, the target's empathy, sense of loyalty, and diligence actually attract the manipulator's attention. A person who is quick to volunteer, eager to accept blame, and hesitant to express their needs openly provides the perfect foundation for the manipulator to work their influence under the radar. One clinical case involved Ethan, an employee celebrated for his conscientiousness and positive attitude. When a manipulative supervisor joined the company, Ethan found himself receiving small pieces of public praise, only to have private conversations focused on the ways improvement was still possible. The supervisor would compare Ethan's willingness to pick up slack for others as evidence that some team members, unlike you, lack the right work ethic. This sharp contrast, though intended as flattery, quietly burdened Ethan with the responsibility not just for his own performance, but also for maintaining standards across the whole team. Each time the supervisor sighed after a failed task or lamented about being let down, Ethan felt personally implicated, even if the failings belonged to others. Over time, his initial self-assurance ebbed, replaced by anxiety, increased hours, and a shrinking sense of personal accomplishment. The manipulator's insight lay in recognizing Ethan's internal rewards for affirmation, transforming those desires into chronic overextension and growing self-doubt. In other contexts, such as close friendships or familial bonds, the same underlying playbook prevails. Take Leah, the eldest cousin in a sprawling, interconnected family. Relatives constantly sought her out for holiday coordination, mediation of disputes, and planning special events with the unspoken expectation that she would absorb the stress and inconvenience. Framed as just because you're so good at it, this tactic seemed on the surface to be congratulatory, yet each compliment hid an unwritten demand, enforced by disappointment whenever Leah attempted to delegate or prioritize her own needs. With every instance where she complied, her identity acquired a new layer of duty and obligation, solidifying the expectation that her value lay in constant self-sacrifice. Psychological manipulation on this level does not start or end with tasks and favors. It is enforced repeatedly through words, silence, body language, or even exaggerated praise. Over time, the victim no longer questions whether their boundaries are valid. Instead, their first reflex is to check whether they might be letting anyone down. This relentless cycle triggers a subtle but powerful mental shift. Self-worth migrates from an internal sense of value to an external scoreboard held entirely by others. When this process is complete, resistance feels dangerous, as if even a small attempt to reclaim one's identity might destroy all relationships and sense of belonging. Understanding these tactics, the strategies for target selection, the use of supposed praise, and the subtle cues that drive compliance, is not merely about self-protection. It is a necessary step toward rebuilding lost confidence. Seeing patterns in your own experience grants the clarity that begins to loosen the manipulator's grip. In the next section, we will dive into exactly how these cycles tighten, escalating beyond momentary self-doubt into prolonged patterns of captivity and diminished identity. Chapter 5. Setting Boundaries Without Shame. Late on a rainy evening, Maya receives a familiar phone call from her cousin, who greets her with a forlorn sigh, immediately launching into complaints about being neglected and feeling unappreciated by family. After a few minutes, the conversation shifts from loneliness to accusations about Maya's absence at a recent family gathering, peppered with reminders of all the times the cousin had made sacrifices for Maya in the past. Every rebuttal Maya offers is skillfully turned against her. Her busy schedule becomes proof that she doesn't care. Her need for rest is weaponized as a sign of selfishness. The subtle message is unmistakable. Maya is only worthy of affection if she is perpetually available, and any attempt to carve out space for herself is recast as a betrayal. Over time, answering the phone becomes an act of dread, and even harmless replies feel risky. Yet Maya's reluctance to stand up for her time almost always loses to the tidal wave of guilt that follows each call. Unbeknownst to her, she has been drawn into a dangerous cycle in which real boundaries are seen as offenses, and the price of setting limits seems to grow higher the longer she avoids it. This scenario is a window into a pervasive dynamic. Setting boundaries is one of the most difficult undertakings when living under a tide of guilt-based manipulation. What makes matters more oppressive is how skillfully manipulators distort the very concept of boundaries, teaching their targets that self-care is equivalent to abandonment and that saying no is synonymous with cruelty. The ultimate goal of the manipulator in these instances is clear: unquestioned compliance and unending access, whether that means emotional reassurance, financial support, or even control over how time and energy are spent. Through persistent pressure, emotional narratives, and selective memories, the manipulator blurs the natural limits between self and other until the victim is uncertain where their responsibilities end and where another's sense of entitlement begins. Most victims, caught in this invisible struggle, do not recognize the extent of their entrapment until the cumulative effects spill over into exhaustion and resentment. Maya, in attempting to avoid conflict and honor old obligations, sees her freedoms slip quietly away. Her time is no longer her own, and her voice grows softer each time she surrenders her plans to keep peace or avoid a confrontation. In an earnest desire not to harm relationships, she unlearns the ability to protect the boundaries that keep her emotionally whole. The more she tries to compensate, the more the manipulator pushes further, their agenda now enforced by Maya's own urge to avoid shame and be seen as the good relative. In this way, guilt not only becomes the lock, but the key that keeps the door securely closed. What lingers under the surface is a societal myth that boundaries are selfish, a misconception actively fed by those who stand to gain from blurred lines. Maya's plight is anything but uncommon. By the time that urgency for change is finally felt, the original conflict is often deeply buried under layers of regret and fear. The trap tightens as each act of self-preservation feels morally ambiguous, driving the victim to rehearse apologies before they even attempt to explain themselves. Yet at the heart of recovery from ongoing manipulation lies the necessity to reclaim and reinforce one's boundaries, not as an act of rebellion, but of survival. Exposing the game for what it is offers the opening for transformation, the only path to a future where space for oneself is not a transgression, but a right. Only then can a new definition of self, free from invisible shackles, begin to emerge. The relentless erosion of boundaries through guilt-based manipulation generates a cascade of emotional turmoil. At first, the targeted individual, hoping to soothe relationships, feels a sense of fleeting relief each time they give in. Yet the aftermath is far more corrosive. Resentment builds, exhaustion becomes familiar, and hope for reciprocity steadily fades. Clarity about one's own needs blurs beneath a persistent anxiety about being too selfish. Each decision, no matter how small, turns into a risk calculation. Will this request for personal space upset someone, provoke guilt, or jeopardize the relationship altogether? The cycle spins up internal conflict and confusion, as the need to protect oneself is pitted against powerful conditioning to maintain approval at all costs. This dynamic leaves an indelible mark on both relationships and self-esteem. Consider the example of Joel, who had a reputation in his circle as endlessly reliable. Friends regularly expected him to sort out their plans, loan money, or simply absorb their frustration. When Joel once declined to host a gathering, what followed was a chorus of hurt, loaded jokes, and pointed reminders of all he'd enjoyed thanks to their friendship. Joel's discomfort at asserting his own limits spiraled into guilt, and when he reluctantly relented, the praise that followed was shallow and transactional. Over months, the discomfort grew into dread. Joel began to avoid making plans, kept his opinions to himself, and found each request more difficult to refuse than the last. By the time he considered seeking help, most decisions about his own time and priorities felt loaded with unspoken debts. Extensive research on assertiveness and mental health, such as that published in the journal Personality and Individual Differences, demonstrates that persistent boundary violations lower a person's confidence in their own judgment. Victims become hypersensitive to others' moods and begin to internalize unfounded blame. The manipulative message is clear and constant. If you truly cared, you would say yes. If you were not selfish, you would do more. This message is devastatingly effective because it hijacks the most human qualities, empathy, loyalty, and a desire for harmony, pressing them into the manipulator's service. Over time, relational patterns become lopsided. The giver offers more and more, while the taker rarely faces true consequence or even self-reflection. Why do intelligent and caring people find themselves stuck in such cycles? The most common answer is rooted in conditioning. From an early age, many are taught that saying no is rude, boundaries breed conflict, and good relationships require constant self-sacrifice. Those who are naturally empathetic absorb this lesson especially deeply, making it all too easy for a manipulator to weaponize it. Psychological studies confirm that those with high agreeableness or strong conflict aversion are at particular risk, finding it much harder to interrupt the dynamic, even when it becomes toxic. The cost of continually overriding one's instincts to assert space is a slow-motion collapse of self-confidence, making each attempt to break the pattern feel both dangerous and doomed to fail. The pressure to erase boundaries can be subtle, relentless, and cloaked in the language of love or loyalty, making it difficult to spot even as the damage mounts. When inner discomfort reaches a breaking point, sometimes presenting as anxiety, burnout, or eventual apathy, the need for intervention becomes clear. Recognizing that the inability to set limits is not a character flaw, but the result of deliberate or cultural manipulation, is the first step toward transformation. In the next section, we will sharpen our senses to the warning signs that signal when your boundaries are not being respected, opening the way to renewed self-empowerment and healing. Manipulators targeting boundary-setting instincts seek out individuals who display an unguarded willingness to extend themselves for others. They watch closely for people who are eager to ease tension, say yes when overextended, or apologize excessively for inconveniences both real and imagined. Such traits manifest across a spectrum of life situations, at home, in friendships, and in the workplace. Those least likely to prioritize their needs above the desires of someone else become central figures in the manipulator's plans. The keen observer spots when a person lets themselves be interrupted, changes plans frequently to meet others' requests, or smiles nervously in the face of discomfort, rather than verbalizing what feels wrong. Over time, these microsignals provide manipulators with everything they require to push steadily harder, safe in the knowledge that guilt and obligation have a perfect host. For example, consider Ivy, a healthcare worker known among her colleagues and family for her generosity and compassion. Initially, friends would request small favors, a late-night ride home, a last-minute babysitting session, or coverage for an extra shift. Ivy's reluctance to say no and her eagerness to offer help, even while exhausted, marked her as the ideal support. Her supervisor began to exploit these traits, making appeals such as, "You're the only one we can count on," or "No one else is as understanding as you." Gradually, expectations escalated. Requests became demands, cloaked in flattery, and the cost to Ivy's well-being multiplied. Each time she considered declining, she heard herself described as selfless, and each attempt to draw a line became a source of internal conflict. The weight of responsibility began to feel endless, yet she couldn't pinpoint an exact moment it had tipped from kindness into personal depletion. In family dynamics, Jay's experience reveals the same pattern. He was always tasked with smoothing disputes, remembering birthdays, and bridging gaps in difficult conversations, precisely because he feared being thought of as cold. Even mild protests brought rebukes about his changing character or supposed ingratitude. Jay's invisible compliance was enforced not just by words, but by silent disappointment and conspicuous withdrawal of affection whenever he asserted himself. After years of repeated cycles, Jay found himself avoiding conflict entirely, letting resentment and fatigue set his pace. He no longer responded first to needs out of love, but from a desire to avoid discomfort and maintain fragile peace. As these relationships progress, the victim's psyche shifts in unmistakable ways. Self-doubt grows each time a boundary is tested and found too weak to hold. Internal hesitancy replaces clear self-advocacy. A creeping confusion develops over what is fair, gradually overwhelming the ability to determine whether a request is truly reasonable or yet another violation. The internal script, "It's just easier to go along," replaces healthy reflection as the price of pushback is made to seem catastrophic. If left unchecked, these subtle strategies transform originally generous instincts into instruments of control and exhaustion, where the only relief from unease is further self-sacrifice. Being able to recognize these patterns is not simply academic. It is foundational for resisting the slow loss of personhood at the hands of manipulators who specialize in tearing down boundaries. Sharpening this awareness equips the individual to gauge requests critically and reclaim choice by pulling identity back from a cycle of guilt and obligation. As the next part of your journey unfolds, we will look deeper at how control escalates and how these cycles of violation can ultimately be broken. Chapter 6. Living Guilt-Free with Clarity. It is a bright afternoon at a bustling local cafe where Olivia, once animated and social, now appears distant as she meets her friend for coffee. Her friend describes with painstaking detail how hard life has become and subtly implies that Olivia's absence and declining invitations have been not just noticed, but deeply wounding. The conversation is wrapped in passive disappointment. Statements like, "I guess some people just get too busy for old friends," delivered with a weary smile. Olivia feels a familiar ache of responsibility stir within her. Any attempt to explain her work demands or the need for alone time is greeted with gentle scoffs and stories that highlight every sacrifice and gesture she has supposedly failed to reciprocate. Unspoken yet obvious, the manipulator's goal is clear: restore Olivia's former loyalty, guaranteeing her continued emotional availability and compliance simply by wielding carefully applied guilt. Such encounters are not rare. They reflect a powerful strategy of keeping someone in line, not by command, but by creating a fog of emotional obligation and confusion. Olivia's response is not singular. She pushes aside her original intentions and plans, adjusting to the emotional weather of the moment rather than living according to her own needs and values. But beneath the surface, the true cost accumulates. Her self-trust diminishes, and she begins to question whether it is even possible to act without hurting someone or asserting the right to space. The manipulator's ultimate victory is not simply winning a few hours of Olivia's time, but sowing doubt so deep that every new decision brings with it a shadow of uncertainty and unease. The scope of manipulation extends far beyond this simple coffee table scenario, for the real damage lies in the way guilt becomes a habitual guidepost, coloring every aspect of the victim's life. Instead of openly setting boundaries or asking for what she needs, Olivia learns to second-guess herself. She spends days reliving conversations, searching for mistakes or ways she may have failed others. The search for clarity, for living with a sense of integrity instead of protecting others' feelings at her own expense, feels daunting or even impossible. Most people trapped in these patterns do not see how thoroughly the manipulator's intentions have shaped the fabric of their choices until their relationships, peace of mind, and authenticity seem out of reach. This chapter breaks the illusion that living for the comfort of others without guilt is somehow noble or necessary. The manipulator's skill is so effective that their fingerprints become invisible, camouflaged as concern, tradition, or even love. Too often, the mind learns to rationalize compliance as maturity and regard every challenge to the manipulator's narrative as evidence of selfishness. The longer this persists, the more distant the path to clarity appears, a path quickly overgrown by apologies, avoidance, and the shrinking of possibility each day. Living guilt-free is not about becoming indifferent, but about recognizing when guilt is being used as a weapon rather than a teacher. It demands conscious, sometimes painful, honesty, learning to ask whether an expectation is fair, whether a relationship is reciprocal, and whether your presence is requested as a gift or as a right owed indefinitely. In the end, the journey toward clarity involves dismantling this fog, piece by piece, and reclaiming a sense of agency that has long since slipped into the hands of those skilled in subtle control. The persistent presence of guilt as an unseen guide profoundly distorts a person's emotional health. What often starts as a fleeting, uncomfortable feeling quickly cements into self-doubt, anxiety, and an almost chronic anticipation of disappointing others. The individual becomes internally fragmented, constantly evaluating which decisions might trigger another guilt trip or push away someone they care about. With time, these emotional wounds accumulate, producing an environment where authenticity slowly starves. Every attempt at self-expression or independence is shadowed by the fear of judgment or blame. Decisions that should be simple or satisfying, such as how to spend a weekend or when to say yes or no, are hijacked by swirling thoughts of obligation and an oppressive need to preemptively protect others' feelings. Consider the case of Daniel, who slowly retreated from his own ambitions and friendships as the guilt-based demands of his partner intensified. At first, the criticisms after Daniel spent time with his own friends were couched as mild disappointments, mentions of how lonely the house felt, or reminders of time that could have been spent together. Rather than provoking healthy discussion, these stories bred guilt in Daniel, bent on proving his loyalty and love. Gradually, he adjusted his social life, abandoned personal hobbies, and became wary of any independent action. The price for momentary peace was Daniel's slow withdrawal from the things that once gave meaning and joy to his daily existence. When he finally confided in a therapist, the professional noted that Daniel's decision-making skills had crumbled. He could not weigh his own values against external demands, because guilt always tipped the scales. Extensive studies in relational psychology support the idea that guilt-based manipulation undercuts not just current confidence, but the very foundation of a person's self-esteem. Victims aren't merely convinced to change their behavior, they are persuaded that their most positive traits, responsiveness, conscientiousness, reliability, are deficits unless constantly proven in the service of someone else. As a result, self-talk becomes almost universally negative. If I take care of myself, am I selfish? Will they leave or resent me if I set limits? In research published in the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology, subjects exposed to long-term guilt tactics consistently reported lower self-worth, increased indecision, and diminished capacity to advocate for themselves, even in unrelated environments. It is in this psychological space that clarity is lost, not from a lack of desire for honesty, but from living so long in the fog of emotional manipulation that truth itself seems offensive or unachievable. The reason many people fall for these tactics lies in the fundamental desire for acceptance. Social belonging cues are deeply wired into human survival. Even the suspicion that setting a boundary or requesting space could lead to exclusion can feel intolerable. Manipulators hone in on this instinct, shaping requests and narratives with emotional precision to present guilt as caring, necessary, or even inevitable. Over time, individuals stop scanning for fairness and instead scan obsessively for signs of impending blame or rejection. When maintaining harmony means shrinking your internal world, the gradual loss of clarity becomes both cause and effect. The cycle perpetuates itself, blurring the lines between choice and obligation until autonomy vanishes. The urgency to recognize and dismantle this fog cannot be overstated, for reclaiming clarity is not merely about comfort, but about survival of the self. As we move forward, the next section will focus your attention on subtle but crucial warning signs, often overlooked by even the most insightful, that reveal when guilt is no longer a normal emotion, but a mechanism of control threatening your peace, self-worth, and freedom. Manipulators searching for someone to ensnare with guilt-based tactics are constantly aware of who in their environment is most susceptible to appeals rooted in conscience and emotional obligation. They observe with a discerning eye who offers apologies quickly, who worries about small breaches in etiquette, and who gravitates toward reconciliation in moments of conflict. These are not arbitrary preferences, rather they are carefully selected strategies. Individuals who derive self-worth from being helpful, cooperative, or supportive telegraph strong signals to manipulators that their sense of value can be negotiated and even controlled by subtle appeals to guilt or implied expectation. This identification phase is especially apparent in group settings. Take the case of Sonia, who initially volunteered occasionally to organize social gatherings or offer friendly support to colleagues. Her openness and eagerness to help did not go unnoticed. One particular colleague began testing Sonia's willingness to accommodate by requesting last-minute changes to meeting times, seeking out her assistance long after hours, and praising her dependability in front of others. Over time, requests turned into expectations, and soon, disappointment was voiced openly whenever Sonia asserted a need for rest or time away. Sonia's initial cheerfulness at being relied on mutated into a reluctant obligation, shadowed by anxiety that saying no would result in social disapproval. She started questioning her motives with every decision, unable to discern whether she genuinely wanted to help or was simply evading another wave of guilt. Similar dynamics unfold in many families. Take Owen, the oldest sibling, frequently tasked by his parents to take care of his younger brother and mediate disputes. Early compliments about Owen's mature nature and reliability slowly turned into implied imperatives. When Owen asked for time to pursue his own pursuits or voiced the smallest dissent, disappointment was strategically expressed. Quiet sighs, stories about parental sacrifices, and frequent reminders about family loyalty replaced explicit requests. Slowly, Owen fell into an internal pattern of rehearsal, rethinking every statement, anticipating negative reactions, and restraining parts of his personality for the sake of familial harmony. The message became encoded: attending to others' needs equaled goodness, and seeking balance was synonymous with selfishness. In each case, there is a clear psychological progression within the victim. Initially, there is pride or satisfaction in being a helpful presence, willing to compromise for the sake of others. But as the manipulator's strategy intensifies, a fundamental shift occurs. migration from eager support to uneasy compliance, and from thoughtful generosity to an almost automatic reflex of acquiescence. Self-assessment grows increasingly harsh. The victim becomes hyper-aware of perceived inadequacies, replaying interactions and planning apologies in anticipation of imagined disappointment. Acts of self-care begin to trigger internal alarms, and the idea of living guilt-free is replaced by an ongoing posture of defensiveness. It is essential to understand that manipulators do not only detect these vulnerabilities, but systematically foster and reinforce them. They acknowledge and amplify the target's urge to please, simultaneously pushing the limits further and further. If not recognized, this dynamic leads to chronically blurred boundaries where decisions feel less like autonomous choices and more like solutions to prevent uncomfortable emotions in others. Recognizing the selection and conditioning process is not only critical, it is the pivot on which lasting reclamation of clarity and agency depends. By cataloging these experiences, it becomes evident that the greatest antidote to manipulation is ongoing vigilance and self-reflection before the cycle roots itself too deeply. In the next section, we will bring into focus how manipulative cycles escalate even further, capturing the victim's sense of possibility and replacing clarity with a maze of subtle, self-reinforcing traps. Breaking free from the invisible grip of guilt-driven manipulation demands courage, awareness, and a willingness to reclaim your true sense of self. This book has unraveled the subtle tactics used to erode confidence, rewrite boundaries, and turn empathy into vulnerability. By understanding these psychological games, identifying patterns in your own life, and learning to rebuild strong self-worth, you take the first powerful steps toward lasting freedom. Thank you for investing your time and attention on this journey to greater clarity and independence. If you found these insights valuable, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe to Stealth Psychology.